Good morning and welcome to Morning Movie News, where just a few days ago we talked about the possibility of Tom Hiddleston being the new James Bond. His chances emboldened by a heavy wave of betting on him as the top favorite based on his performance in The Night Manager, the miniseries which recently ran in the UK and is currently a top performer on iTunes. But despite all the talk about who could be the new James Bond, Idris Elba, Tom Hardy, Hugh Jackman threw his hat back in the ring saying, I shouldn't have turned it down a few years ago. But through all that, there was always the hope for many that Daniel Craig would perhaps do one or two more. Even the people who make the Bond movies had hoped that he would do one or two more, and it was revealed this morning had even offered him $100 million to do so. But Daniel Craig, it has also been confirmed, said no, which is a very sad but yet not unforeseen turn of events, because as we all know, he was very salty on his press tour for Spectre, and many people felt that he actually hurt Spectre's box office performance because he was so nonplussed about being in the film. I mean, if James Bond himself isn't excited about the latest Bond movie, why should any of us be? So it is odd that the Bond people would even offer him $100 million to continue. But I think you can understand where they were coming from because his Bond movies have done so well. He's the first Bond to join the $1 billion club, and he did breathe new life into the franchise. We loved his older Bond, who came from a less affluent background, who had a chip on his shoulder and something to prove, right? But I think also, to be fair, Casino Royale was his first and best Bond movie, and he was never able to recapture that. And also, in all fairness to Daniel Craig, he got stuck with the writer's strike, which really derailed the franchise. He's been Bond for like 10 years, but has not put out what you would expect to be the number of movies one would put out in 10 years of being Bond. And of course, he's injured himself quite seriously while performing some of his own stunts. So while it's understandable where both sides are coming from, I think at the end of the day, the person who handled this the poorest would be Daniel Craig, because I think that because he didn't graciously say, you know what, my time as Bond is done. I'm excited to see the new Bond. Instead, it was like, you could not pay me enough to continue to be Bond. And I think it's really unfortunate because it's going to tarnish his whole run on the franchise, right? Like, I think people had such nice thoughts about Daniel Craig as Bond. I mean, for many, including myself, he was the best Bond. He'd even surpassed Sean Connery. But now, I don't know. I mean, Sean Connery didn't seem too plussed about it either toward the end, which is odd because, being Bond, it's interesting. It's a little bit like David Schwimmer, who played Ross on Friends. He had this famous saying where he was like, I'm an actor, I'm not just Ross, and I don't want to be known as Ross for the rest of my life. So every time I see David Schwimmer today, like when he was on the recent O.J. Simpson miniseries, which was fantastic, by the way, on FX, I was like, well, David Schwimmer, maybe you will redefine yourself. But I think it's really insensitive for all these actors to say that when there are so many non-working actors who would kill to just have one major role that defines them and brings joy to millions of people, right? Like, if you just want to act for the sake of your craft, maybe you shouldn't go into the movie business, the TV business, which is all about commercialism and establishing long-running characters, etc. Stick to the theater and those kind of, and independent film, I guess, those kind of endeavors. But, I think that some of you, I'm sure, will defend Daniel Craig's decision, but I think we can all agree that even if he did want to quit, he should have been a lot more gracious about it, and he shouldn't have taken so long to do so, and being so insulting on the press tour for Spectre. I also think it's interesting that the person that he is with today, I don't know if they're actually married, but they're a couple, they live together. Rachel Weisz had the exact same situation happen to her with the Mummy films, which made her successful. The only reason Rachel Weisz gets any work is because she was in the Mummy films with Brendan Fraser. But she eventually dropped out of that franchise because she too was like, you know what, I didn't become an actress to be in movies like The Mummy. And that's really unfortunate. But she wasn't above returning for Bourne. These actors always come back when they need another paycheck, right? When they're like, oh man, I ran out of money. Independent film doesn't pay the bills quite like blockbusters do. But I mean, Daniel Craig, I'm sure, off of the Bond films that he made, does have quite a bit of money and probably enough to last him forever. So again, I understand where he's coming from. I understand why the Bond people wanted him back. But I think that it was just such a horrible such a horrible breakup that it will forever cast a shadow on his tenure as Bond, which is unfortunate. I hope it's not Tom Hiddleston, as we discussed the other day. I'm rooting for Tom Hardy. A couple of you tweeted me that Tom Hardy is actually very eager to be Bond, so I hope that he is on it this morning when this started trending about Daniel Craig. I hope his management team is like, Tom Hardy will drop everything else in the world to be your new Bond, and I think that would be spectacular. So we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens next. But I'm curious, what are your thoughts on it? Does this change how you feel about Daniel Craig as Bond, or are you like, nothing can ruin my Daniel Craig Bond memories? And how do you think this breakup was handled? All right, so that's the first story of the day. Then the second story of the day was a big story that I didn't get to cover yesterday because I was doing that big DC exec shuffle. But of course, we have to talk about the Tetris movie, right? Tetris the Movie. This is actually a really interesting production, and I think it really highlights the movie business in general, but also what's happening with China entering the picture. So Tetris the Movie is actually largely a Chinese venture, but it's going to be officially a joint U.S. and China production. And the U.S. side is being represented by producer Larry Kasanoff, who was the producer of the Mortal Kombat films back in the 1990s, and he really hasn't done anything since. When you work in Hollywood, if you get one really good movie to your name, it's kind of hard for your career to go away, right? You can always kind of like use that as your calling card. I mean, you kind of fall down the rankings a little bit if you can't get anything else. It's like, oh yeah, that guy. But still, at least you have one hit to your name, so you can still kind of survive. And I have to hand it to Larry. He's surviving, and the fact that he got this Tetris China deal together is pretty darn impressive for him. This could actually pull him back out of his slump that he has not been able to get out of. So he's going to represent the U.S. interests, and they're at Cannes trying to sell the rights to this. That's how this whole discussion came up. We talked about distribution rights the other day. And you sell international ones at a film festival like Cannes. But anyway, this is going to be largely made in China. It'll have Chinese cast and Chinese locations. It's hopefully going to be a trilogy, and they say they have a really clever sci-fi thriller twist for it. But what's really smart about this is that it's only going to cost $80 million. They've got an $80 million price tag on it. That's very good. That's a very manageable budget. Because I think when you have a brand like Tetris, and they're working with the Tetris company, so it's official. I guess they'd have to, or they would be sued. But that's, I think, very encouraging that the Tetris people are actively involved. And when you have like such a strong Chinese aspect to it, I think the potential return on $80 million is quite high. I think that this movie seems like a good investment to me. I would certainly take the meeting if I were in Cannes. I am wondering if it's going to be English language or not. I think it would be ridiculous not to have an English language version if you really want to get a return for your investment. But they don't necessarily have to, because right now, 2 of the top 10 movies for the year globally are from China and are Chinese language films, The Mermaid and Monster Hunt. And they're like formidable contenders. The Mermaid's like over 500 million. So I think that the Tetris movie could be a surprise hit, and it's just interesting to see a deal like this come together. A deal that probably wouldn't be that big if it were just in the US, but with the Chinese development, with the locations, the cast, potentially being able to bring down the budget, and also access to the Chinese audience, and a very strong push in China because of it's so Chinese, and there's so much money to be made in China at the box office, suddenly this deal becomes, I think, really attractive. So it's just a cool way to see how China's changing the movie game a little bit, and also just a good example of a scrappy producer who just refuses to go away. All right, so that's the second story of the day. Now, I'm not saying I'm definitely going to watch the Tetris movie, but I'm interested in it, not just from a business perspective, but, let's see what China's got. I'd be very curious to see what they come up with and if they're able to make the Tetris movie work. And also, remember that thing they did like Human Tetris like maybe a year or so ago? It was like a YouTube video or something, right? Like a lot of people were into that, so maybe China would be really into a Tetris movie. So let's see. All right, so that's the second story of the day. Now, the third story of the day is just a fantastic business story. The third story, I can't often put it into the metadata, so it's like kind of like one where I can be a little bit more creative. And I think this is a really good story that a lot of you are going to appreciate. So Disney just promoted one of its executives. He is African American, Tendo Ngenda, very close to Tetris. But Tendo Ngenda really is doing very well at the Disney company. So he has just been promoted to Exec VP of Production at the Disney Studios, meaning he works under Alan Horn, who we just talked about yesterday as the individual who Kevin Feige reports to. So Tendo has really made a name for himself since he started at the studio in 2010, overseeing some of Disney's live-action properties. He is behind Cinderella and the upcoming Beauty and the Beast, Dumbo with Tim Burton. He's developing a young Merlin movie and also the Mulan live-action film. And now, I'm pointing these out because I want to point out the diversity of Tendo's product line, the production line, what he's putting out there. He's not in there just with an agenda, but he's not ignoring the good that he could potentially do as an executive either. Because since he balances all that out with The Queen of Katwe coming up, that's his, and then also A Wrinkle in Time, where he got Ava DuVernay to direct. So I think that Tendo is a fantastic example of an executive who is able to bring diversity into the ranks at Disney, but not be an SJW executive, right? Like, I'm only going to make Black-centric films. I'm only going to try and change the face of Hollywood. He's like, no, I'm going to make successful movies that are traditional, that are just what Disney wants, but then I'm going to take that success and my new clout at the studio and parlay it into maybe taking some risks and instituting some change. But I'm not going to totally switch gears either. I'm going to do both. I'm going to run on both tracks so that Disney sees me as a real value to the company in many different ways. So I think that's just spectacular. I can't think of a better example of how we'd like to see diversity function in Hollywood. So I think that Tendo is definitely a talent to watch, and maybe one day he could be running the Disney studios, because Cinderella was certainly a huge hit. Beauty and the Beast looks like it's come together beautifully, and I think The Queen of Katwe looks like an excellent movie. So I just wanted to put that out there as an example, because we talk so much about diversity behind the camera in terms of directing and writing, but this is a really great example of diversity behind the camera with executives, which again, great. There are tons of career paths in Hollywood. You should always be considering all of them. And I think it's important that we highlight all the people that are participating in the movie business so that we can, add a little bit of glamour to those other positions. All right, so those are the three stories of the day. Now, the viewer question comes from CJ Parker, frequent BTT viewer, CJ Parker, who awesomely sent me like a video of himself before he went to see The Jungle Book, which I thought was really cool on Instagram. But CJ said, he had a great question. So he said, why are the Oscars taken more seriously than the Golden Globes? Again, great question, CJ. And I think that it's interesting to see awards season change so much as there become not only more awards shows, but you see more television channels getting into the game, right? Like suddenly the Critics' Choice Awards are promoted, the SAG Awards are promoted, etc. And also, I think the Oscars have lost a little bit of their luster because of the controversy surrounding Oscars So White, and then also Chris Rock's jokes about the Asian community, unfortunately. And then also just, an overall feeling of them being out of touch with what audiences, and also Hollywood in general today, are trying to achieve. So the Oscars, though, is pretty Teflon overall, though. So here's why the Oscars are considered the best. Well, they're last, for one thing, which I think to some degree hurts them, though, in the ratings, because, there's not that much surprise by the time the Oscars comes around. But anyway, the Oscars was the first big award show, and also it's the one where you're voted on by your peers, right? It's like there's something to be said about being first, right? Apple with the iPhone and stuff like that, right? Pixar, Marvel, Coca-Cola. If you're first, you kind of become there's a relationship that's developed with audiences in the industry. So that's something that benefits the Oscars. And again, it's supposedly voted on by your peers. But when you start to tarnish the influence of peers by saying they're out of touch and they're not the right peers, that's when the Oscars really gets in trouble, which is why you're seeing them try to restructure. However, the Golden Globes also has its own problems in that the Golden Globes, are voted on purely by the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, a small group of journalists who are easily bought, literally bought. That's a very well-known fact in Hollywood. Ricky Gervais even joked about it openly when he's hosted. But I think that the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, they have very good ratings on NBC. They put together a very good show, which is why it's considered important. And also, they're pretty good at predicting who's going to win at the actual Oscars. So that's another reason. It's the road to Oscars. Like, how many wins can you get to help your campaign? So I would say in the hierarchy of awards shows, it goes the Oscars, the Golden Globes, and then the Guild Awards, like the SAG Awards, the Directors Guild, the Producers Guild, the Writers Guild, because the Academy voting blocks are basically, those guilds. So they're also very indicative of what you're going to see happen at the Oscars. So that's the hierarchy, I think, right now. Critics' Choice Awards, not really anywhere on the radar there, because again, it doesn't really influence the Oscars at all. It's hard. I mean, it's really what's going up to that event. So the Oscar, that's what it is. Also, so that's what it is. Also, the timing. Oscars is last. It's like what everybody's working towards. It's the big kahuna. So I hope that answers your question, CJ. But I think you are seeing a shift in awards shows' importance, and we'll see if the Oscars can fix that problem. It's a big one. It's a really big problem. I think it's almost like what you see happen with talk shows. Talk shows used to be so big, but then audiences eventually decided that they felt they were watching like canned fake interviews, and now talk shows are better known for the opening jokes and the monologues and also the sketches they can do, and the sketches not only with the host, but the host and the guests. Like, as you'll see, talk shows have turned into almost sketch shows, which have YouTube clips rather than interviews, which is really an interesting development on its own. All right, so that's today's morning movie news. Thank you so much for tuning in. I look forward to continuing the conversation down below. Be sure to comment on the top 3 stories, CJ's viewer question, anything you'd like to see covered tomorrow, any questions that you might have. Thanks for watching. Bye.